June 5, 1944. Dawn over the steaming jungles of Burma. The air is thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of diesel and tropical decay. You stand on the tarmac of an operational airfield near Bamo, watching the impossible take shape against the bruised purple of the morning sky. It's too big, too sleek, and impossibly high. This isn't a familiar sight. This is an apparition. Major Jiro Takeda, a fighter pilot veteran with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, JAAF, shields his eyes. He has been transferred to this remote forward base specifically to intercept the new American threat. Around him, ground crew and fellow pilots murmur, pointing westward. The target is visible only as a glint of silver far above the standard ceiling of his Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa fighter. It is the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Takeda had only seen grainy intelligence photographs of this behemoth of four-engine bomber designed for an unprecedented combination of altitude, speed, and range. Its initial operational theater was here, in the China-Burma India (CBI) theater, staging out of airfields in Chengdu, China, to hit targets like Bangkok and, today, the railway yards of Rangoon. Takeda receives the transmission crackling in his headset, relayed from a distant ground observer post. Target altitude estimated at 10,000 meters. Speed approximately 350 kilometers per hour. Takeda scoffs, adjusting the leather of his flight helmet. 10,000 meters? Pure fiction. The Americans always exaggerate. Yet, the briefing later that morning confirmed the troubling estimates. The B-29 was designed to cruise well above the effective ceiling of the best Japanese interceptors, and certainly beyond the range of most Boffa's anti-aircraft batteries. That evening, Takeda found himself in the cramped, fan-cooled briefing room with Captain Kenji Hara, an aeronautical engineer attached to the local command. Hara was dismissive, almost smug, holding up a schematic of the B-29's fuselage cross dash. They have achieved this range and altitude through over-engineering and sacrifices, Hara stated, tracing a line on the diagram. Look here. To save weight, the Americans have utilized paper-thin aluminum alloy for the fuselage skin, barely 1 millimeter in thickness. The armor protecting the crew positions? Minimal. To incorporate pressurized cabins, they've made the whole machine fragile. Hara smiled, folding the document. It is a magnificent machine in theory, Major, but it is a glass cannon. A single burst of our 20mm cannon shells will shred its internal structure and rip its thin skin like tissue paper. It may fly high, but it is fundamentally vulnerable. This judgment-fragile, thin-skinned, a glass cannon was the consensus of the Imperial Naval and Army technical staffs. They believed the B-29 was too structurally compromised by its weight-saving design to withstand combat damage. They saw a brittle giant, not a harbinger of industrial doom. They had measured the aluminum, but they hadn't yet measured the vast, unseen industrial power that built it. The altitude barrier mountain hash they had measured the aluminum, but they hadn't yet measured the vast, unseen industrial power that built it. The Japanese High Command's assessment was reinforced by their early combat experiences in the CBI theater. Major Takeda and his fellow pilots, flying their lighter, more maneuverable fighters, could certainly reach the operational ceiling of the B-29, but only after a long, stressful climb that left them nearly stalled and barely able to maneuver. In mid-June 1944, Takeda led a sortie of 6 Ki-43 Hayabusas attempting an interception over Changsha. They spotted the American Formation 20 Superfortresses flying in tight boxes. Takeda pushed his Hayabusa to its absolute limit, the engine straining and vibrating violently in the thin air. Altitude 9,000 meters. Takeda gasped over the radio, the cabin freezing despite the thin heating. We are losing speed. We must make one clean pass only. The B-29s were cruising effortlessly at 10,000 meters, $33,000 feet, an altitude so high that the Japanese pilots, who lacked pressurized cabins, were reliant on bulky oxygen masks and felt every degree of the extreme cold. More importantly, the margin between the bomber's cruising height and the fighter's maximum sustainable altitude was razor-thin. Takeda realized that the American design philosophy wasn't about resilience, it was about avoidance. When Takeda finally got within firing range, his fighter was wallowing. His controls were mushy, the aircraft dangerously sluggish. He unleashed a short burst of his $12.70 $text machine guns at the nearest B-29, but the shells tracked slowly in the thin air, losing energy rapidly. He broke away, struggling to keep his fighter from falling out of the sky, unable to execute the aggressive, sustained dogfight tactics that had won them air superiority early in the war. The thin armor mentioned by Captain Hara wasn't the B-29's only defensive measure. The entire Superfortress formation was protected by a revolutionary, remote-controlled firing system. Gun turrets, controlled by specialized gunners sitting in pressurized blisters and sighting through analog computers, spat out coordinated fire from all directions. The sheer volume of fire was a terrifying deterrent, making a close-range approach suicidal, especially when the Japanese fighters were already operating at their aerodynamic limits. Takeda's sortie was a failure. They didn't shoot down a single B-29, losing 2 Hayabusas during the chaotic, high-altitude attempt. The thin-skinned giant had sailed through their best efforts, dropping its bombs and turning back toward China, seemingly invulnerable. Back in Tokyo, the WWII, Imperial General Headquarters, received reports focusing on the altitude and the remote armament, but the narrative of fragility persisted. Analysts argued that the Americans were simply lucky to be operating over such long distances where ground defenses were non-existent. The fundamental strategic oversight, the underestimation of the B-29's long range and massive payload, was still minimized in favor of the tactical obsession with the bomber's perceived structural weakness. The real test, they theorized, would come when the B-29 staged closer and faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire and persistent interception over the Japanese home islands themselves. The strategic shift, the real test, they theorized, would come when the B-29 staged closer and faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire and persistent interception over the Japanese home islands themselves. The strategic landscape shifted violently in late 1944. Following the capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the Americans gained forward bases less than $2,500 kilometers from the heart of industrial Japan. This eliminated the logistical nightmare of flying over the Himalayas from China and allowed the B-29s of the newly formed XXI Bomber Command to strike directly at the enemy's core. The WWII finally acknowledged the threat, but their response remained flawed, centered on the initial flawed analysis. If the B-29 was fragile, it could be countered by aggressive interception. They developed the fighter bomber doctrine, prioritizing modified interceptors like the Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki, capable of the higher altitudes required. On November 24, 1944, the first massive B-29 raid, composed of over 100 aircraft, struck Tokyo for the first time since the Doolittle raid. Admiral Takajiro Onishi, a leading figure in the Navy General Staff, observed the attack summaries, maintaining his skepticism. The wind currents at that altitude, the jet stream, are fierce, Onishi remarked to his planning staff. They will push the formations off target. The navigational difficulties alone, combined with their flimsy structure, will cause them to break formation or fall apart. We merely need to wait, and our defenses will be sufficient. The Japanese defense utilized sophisticated tactics, employing both high-altitude interception and flak, but the B-29s proved unexpectedly resilient. While individual Superfortresses suffered heavy damage from $20/text mm and $30/text mm cannon shells tearing the thin aluminum skin, as predicted, the B-29 was designed with exceptional structural redundancy. Its large wings and multiple control cables were spread out, making it extremely difficult for one hit to cripple the entire aircraft. Crucially, the initial bombing efforts, focusing on high-altitude precision targeting of aircraft factories like the Nakajima plant in Musashino, were not yielding the catastrophic results the Americans hoped for. High winds, unforeseen by Japanese analysts but present nonetheless, scattered the bomb loads. The Japanese, seeing the relative inaccuracy, found temporary validation for their skepticism. They cannot strike with precision from that height, reported Colonel Masao Fukaida, analyzing post-raid photos. The B-29 is a weapon of attrition, not surgical damage. The cost in fuel and material for this is astronomical for the Americans. They cannot maintain this pace. This was the final, devastating miscalculation. The Japanese focused on the precision problem, while utterly failing to grasp the true terror of the B-29, the sheer volume and velocity of its delivery. They measured the fragility of the skin, but they never measured the capacity of the American industrial base to replace every bomber, every crew, and every pound of ordnance, a capacity that dwarfed Japan's by orders of magnitude. The early attacks were just a prelude. The Americans were learning, adapting, and gathering an even deadlier payload. The Firestorm Doctrine fire. The Americans were learning, adapting, and gathering an even deadlier payload. The fundamental shift occurred in early 1945, driven by the realization that high-altitude precision bombing was ineffective against widespread Japanese industry, largely due to the jet stream and target concealment. The man who orchestrated this terrifying change was Major General Curtis LeMay, taking command of the XXI Bomber Command in January 1945. LeMay recognized that the B-29's true strength was not its altitude, but its payload capacity and range, especially when combined with a new, devastating strategy: low-level area bombing with incendiaries. The Japanese had based their entire defense strategy on forcing the B-29s to fly high, believing the altitude was the bomber's only defense. They mocked the B-29's thin armor, but they had fatally misjudged the potential payload that this light structure allowed. LeMay exploited this tactical blind spot. He ordered the B-29s stripped of their excess weight. All defensive machine guns, except the tail guns, were removed, and the cumbersome remote control sighting systems were deactivated. This move, which shocked many American airmen, was a calculated risk that allowed the aircraft to carry even more bombs, specifically massive loads of the newly perfected M69 incendiary clusters. The removal of armament further validated the early Japanese intelligence on the bomber's fragility, but the accompanying tactical change rendered that fragility irrelevant. The B-29s would now fly at extremely low altitudes, as low as 5,000 to 9,000 feet, eliminating the jet stream's effect and enabling saturation bombing. This altitude was suicidal for any heavy bomber facing conventional defenses, but LeMay bet correctly on the Japanese not anticipating or adapting quickly enough. The first test of this new doctrine came on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, over Tokyo. A massive wave of 334 B-29s, flying low and fast, unleashed nearly 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs over the densely packed wooden and paper residential or industrial areas. The result was instantaneous catastrophe. The bombing created a gigantic firestorm, a self-sustaining inferno where the heat was so intense it created its own hurricane-force winds. The conflagration was not merely destructive, it was total. The B-29s, despite flying lower where Japanese flak and fighters were deadliest, sustained surprisingly light losses. The anti-aircraft fire was aimed and fused for high altitudes, and the few Japanese fighters that scrambled couldn't effectively engage the fast, low-flying formations in the darkness and smoke. Rear Admiral Hiroshi Ono, commanding a naval staff in Tokyo that night, watched the sky turn an apocalyptic red. He had seen the reports detailing the B-29's thin skin, but what was that armor against a payload designed to turn an entire city into a furnace? The B-29, the fragile giant, had become the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, using its range and payload to carry the fire directly to the enemy's unarmored heart. The cost of denial: broken heart. The B-29, the fragile giant, had become the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, using its range and payload to carry the fire directly to the enemy's unarmored heart. The scale of the destruction following the March 10, 1945, Tokyo raid shocked even the Americans and absolutely traumatized the Japanese command staff. The fires consumed over $41 square kilometers $1, $15.80 square miles $1 of the city, killing an estimated 100,000 people, a death toll comparable to the later atomic bombings and rendering over 1 million homeless. This devastation was repeated across every major industrial center: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama, over the following months. The initial Japanese assessment: the mockery of the B-29's thin armor, was revealed to be catastrophically wrong, not because the skin wasn't thin, but because the strategy of focusing on the bomber's defensive weakness entirely missed its revolutionary offensive strength. The Japanese had prepared to fight an aerial duel at high altitude, a fight that the B-29 simply refused to accept. Admiral Onishi and the naval staff, who had spearheaded the skepticism, were now faced with the systematic dismantling of Japan's war machine. The very industrial facilities they relied on, the machine tool plants, the engine assembly lines, the petrochemical factories, were concentrated in these wooden cities and were disappearing in smoke. The true cost was industrial paralysis. Japan's decentralized wartime production, which relied on countless small workshops and home industries integrated into the massive zaibatsu, industrial conglomerates, was perfectly vulnerable to the area firebombing strategy. Captain Hara's technical assessment had been right about the B-29's light structure, but he and his colleagues had failed to factor in the sheer American capacity for mass production and strategic adaptation. The fact was, the US could lose B-29s at a rate that would cripple Japan's entire air force, and still have dozens waiting to take their place. Japan, already starved of raw materials by the US submarine blockade, simply could not replace its lost industrial capacity or its limited stock of high-altitude interceptors. The Superfortress was not a fragile glass cannon. It was a tireless industrial engine, bringing the full weight of the American economy which had produced these bombers by the thousands to bear on Japan's cities. The transition from precision bombing, which caused minimal structural damage, to firebombing was the final, inescapable lesson. The Japanese technical staff had laughed at the B-29 for its aluminum thickness, yet that very design choice enabled the payload necessary to burn down the enemy's production centers from low altitude, where the B-29 was momentarily vulnerable, but devastatingly effective. By the summer of 1945, with almost 70 major cities devastated, the Japanese naval staff could no longer deny the truth. The war had been lost not in the skies above Iwo Jima, but in the aircraft assembly plants of Renton and Wichita, where the B-29 was born in numbers Japan could never comprehend. The unmeasurable factor. By the summer of 1945, with almost 70 major cities devastated, the Japanese naval staff could no longer deny the truth. The war had been lost not in the skies above Iwo Jima, but in the aircraft assembly plants of Renton and Wichita, where the B-29 was born in numbers Japan could never comprehend. The final, bitter admission of error came in the aftermath of Japan's surrender. High-ranking Japanese military and technical officials, during post-war debriefings with the strategic bombing survey teams, confirmed their initial, crippling misjudgment. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, and other members of the Naval General Staff, expressed a collective astonishment that transcended the simple tactical failure. Their skepticism had not just been rooted in the B-29's thin armor, but in the assumption that America's massive industrial effort would be constrained by the same logistical and material bottlenecks that paralyzed Japan. They viewed the B-29 as an over-engineered luxury item that would prove too expensive and fragile to deploy en masse. "We believed that even if the Americans could build such a large, complex machine," one captured engineer stated, "the operational losses, the maintenance demands, and the sheer consumption of fuel and material would limit their effective striking force to a few squadrons." What they had utterly failed to quantify was the unmeasurable factor, the overwhelming, frictionless nature of American mass production. The B-29 Superfortress was not merely an aircraft. It was the symbol of an economy capable of producing over 3,900 units of the most advanced bomber ever conceived, while simultaneously supplying a global two-front war. The Luftwaffe had suffered similar industrial attrition in Europe, but Japan, fundamentally dependent on imported resources and with a brittle, centralized industrial structure, had no resilience. The mockery directed at the bomber's thin armor proved ironically fatal because that light structure was the key to maximizing the bomb load, up to $20,000 text, pounds, a dollar, the critical feature that enabled the strategic firebombing campaign. Had the Japanese strategists correctly assessed the B-29's true offensive potential, its incredible range coupled with an unsurpassed payload facilitated by its light construction, they might have shifted priorities away from high-altitude interceptors to a decentralized industrial dispersal strategy much earlier. Instead, they were fixated on winning a tactical aerial battle that the Americans had already chosen to bypass. The $1 text, millimeter, a dollar of aluminum skin, which they initially derided as fragile, carried the explosive capacity that incinerated the foundations of the Japanese Empire. The war was won not just by the technological superiority of the B-29, but by the American economic furnace that built a seemingly endless supply of them. The Superfortress was the ultimate delivery system for industrial might, and its success confirmed the terrifying truth: a war of total attrition against the United States was simply unwinnable.